Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery here, and this time around I wanted to follow up on my first video on the 180-600, that preview video I did before it was released, with some sharpness tests and AF speed tests that I couldn't do with a prototype lens. Also, thank you to everyone who commented to let me know what lenses you wanted me to test. Unfortunately, I couldn't meet every request since I'm limited to the lenses that I own, but I do have a nice selection based on your comments. Before we begin, I want to get 4 quick preliminaries out of the way, and I promise they'll be quick. First, here's a slide that covers my sharpness testing methodology. I don't want to go over this line by line, so pause the video to read if you're interested. The rest of us are moving on. Second, keep in mind that when you're looking at these comparisons, the sample size is small. I only have a single copy of each lens to test, so it's possible there could be some variation in my copy of the lens compared to others out there in the wild. Also, keep in mind that these tests are at relatively close range, not minimum focus distance, but relatively close. The lenses tested may perform differently at different distances. Third, this is a long video covering a lot of lenses. In this slide, you'll find the timestamps for the lenses I've tested, and I have this video divided into chapters on YouTube as well. I don't see any reason to watch the entire video. I recommend skipping to the tests that are of the most interest to you. However, I do recommend watching the first test, where we compare the sharpness between various focal lengths on the 180-600 and how well the lens plays with teleconverters. Fourth and finally, when we're looking at these images, keep in mind that we're looking at them at 200% magnification. So we're really digging deep to see the differences here. Let's get to the tests. Okay, so we're going to start off by comparing the lens to itself. And the reason we want to do that is we want to see if there are any focal lengths that are sharper or softer than other ones, and we also want to see how it performs with teleconverters. And I actually went ahead and used the 1.4, and I even put the 2x on because I know people are going to ask. So let's take a look. We're going to go just focal length by focal length. I went 100mm at a time. So first we have 200 versus 300. So let's compare these. We'll start in the center. I'm going to zoom in, and as you can see, looks pretty decent, pretty close. I think 300 has an edge here, and you're going to find that's a little bit of a theme here. If we move around a little bit, you can see as we get towards these edges here, and this is this area right here, as we get towards these edges here, again, it's looking very, very close. I'm not seeing a huge difference between 200 and 300. However, as we get a little bit farther over this way, we're starting to see it. When you start pushing those edges and corners, you can see that 300mm is giving us a little more definition than 200. 200 is looking pretty soft over here towards the edges compared to what we see here. Look at the, like where it's a 16 point versus 16 point here. This definitely is a little bit more crisp. And if we go to the other side, there's another thing we can look at over here. Here's the little hairline example here. That's about the thickness of a hair, and you can see that the 300mm version does look sharper than the 200mm version. It's not that the 200mm version is unusable, it's just that the 300mm is better, at least towards the edges. Again, towards the middle, they're pretty close. I'm not seeing a huge difference towards the middle here. I'm seeing pretty good detail in the middle here. It's just that as we get towards the outer edges here, the 200mm lens is kind of suffering, and the 300mm is holding it together. The 300mm focal length, I'm sorry, not lens. So let's compare 300 to 400. So I'm going to zoom in again and let that load. And this time 300's on this side, 400's over here, and you can see these are neck and neck. There's not really any difference. As we get towards the center, it's looking really, really good. Nice, sharp, crisp, no complaints at all. We can see some texture in here when we're looking at these different patches, these little checkerboards. We're seeing detail in here. The 400 focal length might have a slight edge, but it's very, very close. They both look really, really good. Same on this side. So I'm thinking maybe if I had to make a decision, I'd say maybe 400's ever so slightly, but honestly, it's really tough to tell. And again, we're looking at 200% crops here, not 100%. I don't think you'd see any difference at 100% at all. So let's move on to 400 versus 500. And We're going to zoom in, and as you can see here, and hopefully you can see this on YouTube, but 500 is a little bit sharper than 400. In fact, I think 500 is the sweet spot for this lens. I think that is the sharpest focal length in that area. It's not that 400 or 300 are bad, and as you'll see, 600 is fine too. It's just that 500 has that extra little edge. Now, if we go towards the center and take a look here, you can see, again, I don't know if you can tell on YouTube, but I can definitely tell that there is a little bit sharper points and definition here than there is over here. And if I go up and I look at these here, it looks like these patches, they look very, very close, but I think the 500 one has an edge as we're going along. Again, 500 over here on the right does look a little bit sharper, has a little better crispness to it than the 400 does. So let's go 500 versus 600. And in this case, it's very close. I think 500 still has the edge. This, to me, again, looking at it live on my computer versus on YouTube, this looks sharper to me than this does over here. And if we move things around a little bit, it looks like we're seeing a little bit more pattern in these blocks with the 500 than we are the 600, but it's very, very close. I would not hesitate to use this lens at 5 or 600. Don't take the wrong message from here. Looking here, again, I think 500 has just ever so slight an advantage here, but again, I bet you're hard pressed to tell this on YouTube. It looks really, really good. So 500, 600, it seems like 4, 5, and 600 are kind of where this lens is good. 300 is very good. 200 is good if you're keeping your main subject more towards the center. I wouldn't want to use 200 on the very, very edges. If I had something important there, I would have to do that knowing that that might not be as sharp as what we see at different focal lengths. But for the most part, the lens is very good overall, I'd say, especially when we're talking about the center. This is where all the good stuff happens usually, is in this area and through here. So although we look at these edges, they don't come into play, I don't think, for a lot of wildlife shooters nearly as much as the center does. But still, you want edge-to-edge sharpness simply because if you have a vertical and you have like a bird in there and his head's maybe up in this area here where these dots are, you want that to be nice and crisp too. You want his eye to be nice and crisp. So it does matter to a point. So, but in any event, those are the native focal length comparisons. Let's look at how 600mm compares to 600mm plus a teleconverter. And in this case, we'll start with a 1.4 TC, and we'll zoom into the center. And as you can see, that 1.4 TC does pretty well. I do see more definition over here at 600, but not the difference that I would expect. It's really good. Zoom lenses typically don't like teleconverters, but this one seems to take it pretty well. If we go up and we look at our patterns that we have in our little blocks here, you can definitely see that the non-teleconverted version has a little bit more detail, a little more crispness and definition to it, whereas the one with the teleconverter does look a little softer over here. And as we go to the sides, we can see that 600mm is holding together better than it is with the teleconverter, which is not a surprise. You can see the difference in writing right here in this red panel here. I think that looks pretty obvious. Let me move over here. And again, these are, they're close. It's surprisingly close. The teleconverter does a surprisingly good job, but this is definitely sharper than this is. There's not a lot of question about that. Still, would I use a teleconverter with this lens? If I could live with f9, I think that's the bigger factor for me. If I could live with f9, then yeah, I wouldn't be afraid to use this lens with a 1.4 TC. So how does it compare though when you go with a 2x converter? So this is putting us at 1200mm. And by the way, I literally have a wall blocking my tripod position here when I'm trying to shoot this. That's why this is out a little bit, but I don't think it's going to make a big difference one way or the other. I think you'll get the idea. So let's compare the straight 600 with the 600 with a 2x. And honestly, it's pretty impressive if you zoom in. Considering it's a 2x, it's impressive. But if you look here, this is definitely softer in the center. This is very, very crisp. These lines look really good, and this is a little bit soft. And as we go up here, this is getting mushy over here, and we're shooting f13. And honestly, as we go towards the edges, it's definitely softer. It's noticeably softer over here. And if I go to the other side, again, noticeably softer over here. Look at the bullets and rulers area here, and you can see that this text is much sharper than this one over here. My bottom line is I don't think I would try to use this with a 2x teleconverter. I would use it maybe with a 1.4. But between f13 and the general softening that I'm seeing with the 2x converter with this lens, I think I'd probably avoid using it with that. And instead, I may put a 1.4 on there and do a little cropping if I needed to, instead of using the 2x converter and getting up to 1200 millimeter. I think that's probably a better way to go with this lens. But honestly, I am surprised at how well the zoom lens did take teleconverters. This time we're going to look at the 100-400 versus the 180-600. This is by far the biggest source of questions for me. How does the 100-400 compare, and can you use teleconverters with it? We're going to answer all of that right now. So let's start at 200 millimeter, and we're going to zoom in, and really not much of a contest here. You can see that the 100-400 over here on the right-hand side is definitely the sharper of the two lenses, especially at the sides. We get in towards the center, and once again, it's looking really, really good. And both of them are looking pretty good in the center here. But the sides, though, are what really tell the story here. Here's the 180-600 on the left, and you can see this is okay. It's not great. Again, 200% crops. But still, I mean, look at the sharpness and definition over here with the 100-400. So at 200 millimeter, it's a pretty easy victory for the 100-400. Next, we have 300 millimeters. So let's take a look at that. And once again, we'll just start zooming in, looking around. And in this case, this is once again in the center, looking very, very good. And if you look at the patterns here that you see in these little blocks, you can see the 180-600 at 300 millimeter seems to have a little more definition, a little more crispness, a little sharper. And as we go over towards the sides, you can see that it's neck and neck. I would say that they're almost a tie, but I think there's a slight edge to the 180-600, which was kind of a surprise to me. I kind of thought the 100-400 might beat it across the board, but it does not. And if we look at 300 millimeter here, once again, super, super close. But I'm thinking that the 180-600 has a slight edge on the 100-400. Sorry. But overall, I mean, very, very close. I don't know if in real world use you would actually see the differences. I feel like they're that close at 300 millimeter. Let's go to 400. Here we are at 400 millimeter. So let's start the festivities by zooming in. And as you can see, it looks like the 400 millimeter focal length with the 180-600 is definitely beating 400 millimeter with the 100-400. It's definitely looks like there's a little more crispness to the photo. If we go up, we can look at the patterns in these little blocks, and you can see that they're definitely more crisp here with the 180-600 than they are with a 100-400. If we go over to the side and look, it's pretty darn close, but I'm still giving an edge to the 180-600. We'll look at this side here, and once again, I'd say the 180-600 has it at 400 millimeter. It's not by a ton, but it is enough to notice, and I think it's enough that if you were shooting them side by side and you compared the images that you got from the field, I think you would find the 180-600 is giving you a little more definition than 400 millimeter is with the 100-400. So what about teleconverters? This is probably my biggest question. How does the 100-400 compare to the 180-600 once you put a TC on the 100-400? Kind of get to those upper focal lengths. Let's take a look. We'll start by comparing 500 millimeter to 560 millimeter. And I'm just going to zoom into the center here, and the winner is pretty obvious just based off that. We really don't need to go much farther, do we? The 100-400 with the TC is just not anywhere near the 180-600 at 500 millimeter. Just not any question about it. If we start looking around here, you can see, I'm not going to waste much time here. You can see there's a huge difference here. So what about at 600? Because we know the 500 is kind of the sweet spot for the 180-600. Let's take a look at that. So let's try this at 600 versus 560, because the 600 isn't quite as crisp as the 500 millimeter focal length in the 180-600, but you know what? It is very, very close. So let's zoom into the center. No contest still. It's not enough. If you look over here, these are still very soft compared to what we see here. I'm not going to keep going. I think you get the idea. Finally, again, because I know people ask, let's compare the two lenses around 800 millimeter. In this case, it's going to be 840 for the 180-600 and 800 for the 100-400 because it has a 2x teleconverter on it. I think you know what's going to happen here, but yeah, it's not even close, is it? Once again, we can see that the 180-600 is way better than the 100-400 with the TC, even with the teleconverter. And if we go to the sides, it's not even a contest. I think you get the idea. I personally would not use the 100-400 very much with a 1.4 TC, much less a 2x teleconverter. But if I have the 180-600 in the bag, I would definitely take that over the 100 to 400 with TCs. There's no question about it. If you need to get beyond 400 millimeter, the 180 to 600 is the way to go between these two lenses. In fact, I'd even say if you need to get much above 300 millimeter, I'd recommend the 180 to 600 over the 100 to 400. Now let's take a look at the 180 to 600 at 400 millimeter versus the 400 millimeter f4.5 Z lens. And you can probably guess what's going to happen, right? So let's go ahead and zoom in anyway. So if we look over here, we have the 180 to 600. Over here, we have the prime, the 400 4.5. And as you can see, we do have a little bit extra crispness on this side versus this side. If we go up here and look at our little blocks, we can see that this does seem to have a little more definition. This is definitely has a sharper feel to it than this one over here does. If we start going over towards the side, it becomes even more obvious that this 400 4.5 is edging out the zoom lens at 400 millimeter. And I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone. I mean, we're pitting a prime against a zoom, but honestly, it's surprising how close the zoom actually is to the prime in this case. But keep in mind the prime is also lighter, and we'll take a look at how it performs in the speed test, but hint, it's a little faster. So anyhow, let's take a look though, what happens if we say want to get to a longer focal length. So let's take a look at this lens with a teleconverter and comparable focal lengths with the zoom. So we'll do this comparison having the zoom set at 600 millimeter and this lens at 560. So we're pretty darn close there. Let's zoom in and see what it looks like. So if we go into the center, both are very, very close. And I'd say the zoom might even have a very slight edge on the prime when it comes to sharpness here. If we scroll up a little bit, they are very, very close. I think the zoom does have just a slight edge, even at 600 millimeter. And we know the zoom is actually sharper at 500 than it is 600, so you can make the assumption that it's going to be even a little tiny bit better at 500 millimeter than it is at 6 if you want to think about that direction when you're comparing the 400 4.5 with a 1.4 teleconverter. Well, that's a mouthful. I hope you followed along. But anyway, looking through this, definitely gonna say that the zoom has a little bit of an edge over the prime, which is very surprising to me. I really thought that prime would at least tie it, if not edge it out. But looking at it, it's very, very close across the board here. I'd say that you probably aren't going to see a difference if you're shooting, say, the 400 4.5 with a teleconverter versus just using the 180 to 600 at 500 or 600 millimeter. I don't think you're really going to see much of a difference from a practical field standpoint, but from a technical standpoint, the zoom does have a little bit of an edge here. So let's see what happens when we try to get up to that 800 millimeter range. So we're going to put a 1.4 on the 180 to 600, and we're going to put a 2x on the 400. Let's see how that works out. So let's go ahead and zoom in on our 800 millimeter samples. And if you look here, it is once again very, very close between these two lenses. I'm almost going to give the edge to the zoom though, just by the smallest amount here, because this is very, very close. Looking at some of this though, but it does seem like the zoom has an ever so slight edge on the prime with the 2x converter. Now 2x converter does stress out the lens a little bit more than a 1.4 does, but it's very impressive to see how well this zoom stacks up against a prime with a teleconverter. But they're very, very close. I would say if I had to use one or the other, I would probably pick the zoom. But again, I think this is so close that I think from a practical field standpoint, when you're out there shooting, I'm not sure if you'd really be able to tell the difference between using the prime and the zoom, although the zoom does seem to have just a little bit of an edge. There is a little tiny bit more definition there. So anyhow, that's the 400 4.5 against the 180 to 600. This time we're going to compare the 180 to 600 at 600 millimeter versus the Nikon 600 TC. Now, at first, this seems like kind of a strange comparison. After all, ostensibly, it doesn't seem like someone in the market for a $16,000 lens is also looking at a $1,600 lens, right? But the thing is, there's people like me out there that use both. And the reason is that sometimes you need a zoom. Sometimes a zoom is the difference between getting the shot and not getting the shot. And while I prefer to use my 600 TC, if I'm in a situation where I'm going to use a zoom, I want to see what the differences are. And if that sounds like you, or you're just curious, let's take a look here and see how these two compare. So let's start by zooming into the center. And as you can see, although it's a little bit close, the prime has an edge. I don't think anyone is surprised about that at all. In fact, what surprised me is how close they actually are. But again, we're dead center of the lens here. And a lot of times when I'm comparing lenses, I find that in the center, they are all very, very good. It's hard sometimes to tell the big expensive primes from the zooms. Where you start to see a difference is when you start to go out, and that's what you're paying for with those big primes. So, for example, if we go up to our hairline area here, very clearly the prime has a lot better definition. We can see patterns and stuff here on the paper itself where those are pretty much obscured over here. If we go even deeper towards that corner, like up to this area here, you can see that this is clearly sharper over here than it is over here. This just has better definition and contrast. If we go down to this corner here, look at the writing on both sides here, and it's very, very obvious that the prime really has an edge. Obviously, we're not shooting at the edge of the frame, but I'm just saying from across the frame sharpness, it's hard to beat the prime. But still, even though there is a definite difference, I think the zoom lens actually competes with the prime pretty well here, considering the price difference. But again, I don't think there's any surprises here. The prime is definitely going to be the sharper optic, and this is an f4 versus f6.3. So that's the kind of stuff we're paying for the prime. But looking at the differences here, if I was in a situation where I needed a zoom lens, I would definitely grab the 180-600 if I thought I had a better chance of getting the shot than with the prime. So let's, just for fun, take a look at both of these with a 1.4 teleconverter. So here we are at 840mm. This is at 5.6 for the prime and f9 for the zoom. We're going to zoom in here. And again, not really a big shock that the prime is looking better. So, and if we go up here and look at this stuff here, yeah, you can see the pattern here much better. It has much more acuity. There's better definition here. If we go towards the edges, again, no big surprise. This looks really, really good. This still, I think, looks better than the zoom does, even when the zoom is at its best focal lengths. And this is with a teleconverter on the prime. And once again, we'll look over at this side real quick, and you can see, once again, these are sharper than these over here. I don't think anyone's surprised by this, but bottom line is, though, that although the prime is sharper and faster, if you do need a zoom lens, it's not bad. It looks pretty darn good. It's competing, I think, fairly well with the prime, considering the price difference. Next, I want to compare the 180-600 with a 1.4 TC to the 800 PF. I actually had quite a few people ask me about this, and I think they're trying to decide if they want to get an 800 PF or not, or if just adding a teleconverter to this lens, the 180-600, is enough. Now, the first thing I'm going to show you here, though, before we even get into it, is keep in mind that you're looking at f6.3 with the 800 PF versus f9, an extra stop, with the 180-600 in teleconverter. So let's go ahead and zoom in. Now, the 800 PF here on the right looks pretty good. These look very similar. I'd say the 800 PF probably has a little bit of an edge here, but I don't know that we can actually tell that difference in the field. And as I said earlier in the video, a lot of times it's very difficult to tell the difference between a very expensive lens and a more moderately priced one, or even an inexpensive lens, just by looking in the center, because most times the center is going to look good. What we're paying for, though, is that performance as we move to the edges. So let's start moving to an edge. Go this way a little bit. And as we get over here, you'll see that the prime is starting to show its colors over here. We have this 80% black area here, and if you look at this, it has a lot of texture definition, and over here it's very smeary and smudgy. And if we go up to this little blue one here, you can see we have a lot of pattern in there, but it's kind of going away there. If we look at the difference in the writing over here, it's much more crisp with the 800 PF. versus the 180-600 with a teleconverter. And if you want to go even farther, we can go all the way to that edge and take a look at this little pinwheel here and just look how nice and sharp and distinct these lines are staying versus how this is kind of getting kind of a foggy, smeared look to it. So obviously, you know, there's a big difference in price between these two lenses. But if you really are at 800 millimeter quite a bit, I'd say the 800 PF probably is still something that ought to be on your radar. It's not that the 180-600 is terrible there, but between the extra f-stop and the loss of sharpness as you move out towards the center, I think the 800 PF definitely is the winner here. So this time, let's do the 500 PF. Now I know the 500 PF isn't a native Z lens, but I also know a lot of people are very familiar with this lens. They use them with an adapter on their cameras, and you kind of have an idea of what kind of sharpness this lens brings to the table. So I think this is a good comparison, so you can kind of know what to expect from a sharpness perspective from the 180-600 if you've been shooting a 500 PF. So let's take a look. Start by zooming in here. And as you can see, it's very, very similar. And if we go up here, very, very similar. It's impressive that the zoom does as well and can hold its own against the prime in the center of the frame here. It looks really good. In fact, if anything, I would say the zoom has just a very, very slight edge in the center areas here. It's not much. It's not something you would see in the field. It is very, very slight, but it does look like the zoom has a little bit of an edge. However, as we start going to the sides, that's where the prime is going to shine. And you can see that right here, that just even the 90% and 100% areas here, just that lettering on the prime side here looks sharper already. As we get more towards the right-hand side, you can see the text over here looks good on the 180-600, but it's definitely sharper over here. So you're pretty close in the center. They're just about identical in the center. You're not going to really see a difference. However, as you get towards those edges, that's where the prime is going to shine. And that's kind of what we would expect. That's not a big surprise. So another question is, how do these lenses compare when you add a 1.4 teleconverter? So in the case of the 500 PF, that puts us at 700 millimeter in f8. In the case of the 180-600, it's at 840. We have 140 millimeter more at f9. So let's compare what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And as you can see, in the center, it's pretty darn close still. I think that the prime does have an edge here, but it's not like a huge difference. But there is a little bit of an edge to the prime. As we go up, again, they're looking neck and neck. I'd say the prime does have a little more definition and acuity here than the zoom does. And as we go to the side, let's take a look at that. And obviously the text on the prime lens on the 500 PF with the teleconverter does look sharper than what we see with the zoom. And again, I don't think that's unexpected. Primes do tend to take teleconverters a little bit better than zooms do, but still I think both of these are very usable. Obviously, if I had a choice, if I had both of those lenses with me, I would pick the 500 PF with a teleconverter rather than the 180-600 with a teleconverter. But still, I think that either one of them would end up being very usable from a practical standpoint there. Next, let's compare the 180-600 to the competition, in this case, the Sony 200-600. Now, the Sony 200-600 is well regarded by the wildlife photography community as being a solid performer. So if we find the results from the 180-600 are very similar to the 200-600 Sony, we know that the 180-600 is definitely on its way to also that well regarded in the wildlife photography community status, right? So let's take a look and see. We're going to start at 200 millimeter, zoom in, and immediately I can see that the 180-600 in the center here does look better than the Sony. Let's scroll around a little bit and see. Actually, it looks like the 180-600 at 200 millimeter, which honestly is its weakest focal length based on these tests, looks like it is actually better than the Sony at that focal length. So neither lens is great at 200 millimeter. That's what I'm taking away from this. But yeah, it looks like the 200-600 and 180-600 are both not great at 200 millimeter, but it looks like the Nikon is actually a little bit better at 200 millimeter than the Sony. So there you go. Let's take a look at 300 millimeter next and see how that compares. So once again, let's zoom into the center, and this time it is neck and neck. As we scroll up a little bit, it looks like the Nikon and the Sony are very, very close. These are both virtually identical. I'm not seeing any significant differences between the two. Going back and forth here. No, I mean, they are very, very close. The Sony might have a slight edge. It seems to be a little better on the left-hand side of the lens than the Nikon does with my copies, but overall they look very, very close. I would say, if anything, this is probably a tie, just based on what I'm seeing here. Looking towards the center, I do see slightly more texture in the paper that the target's printed on with the Nikon, but not by much. These are very, very close. Now, in this case, it looks like the Sony's a little better here, so it just kind of depends on where you're looking at the target, I guess, with these two lenses. The 180 the Sony 200-600 has been kind of beaten up in the field a little bit, so it might not be perfectly flat up against this, but in any event, I would call this more or less a tie. So let's take a look at 400mm. So once again, we'll zoom in. And once again, these are just neck and neck. I'm not seeing much difference here at 400mm. Sony might have a slight edge towards the top, but man, it is close, 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 close. These are both looking virtually identical to me. Let's go to this side because the Sony seems like it's a little stronger on this side. No, the Nikon actually looks better this time on this side. So it's very, very, very close. Again, at 400mm here, I'm not seeing a significant difference. Certainly, if you were shooting these two lenses side by side, I seriously doubt that you'd be able to tell, based on sharpness alone, which one was the 180-600 and which one was the 200-600 at this 400mm focal length. They are neck and neck. Now let's compare 500mm, once again zooming in, and we know this is the sweet spot for the Nikon, but it apparently is really good for the Sony too, because these two look really close to me. Coming up here, very close, incredibly close. The Sony is looking pretty good here, though. The Sony, you go back and forth, though, you look at some of these other ones, and it is so darn close between the Nikon and the Sony here. I feel like I sound like a broken record here, but it just seems like, now on this side of the lens, it does seem like maybe the Nikon has a little bit of an edge, but I don't know. Maybe this is a little bit darker here. I think the Sony has a little more vignetting, but honestly, that sharpness level looks about the same now that I'm looking at it a little harder. Scrolling over here. Once again, incredibly, incredibly close. I'm just not seeing much of a difference between these two at 500mm. Looking around here, just trying to find something that says one way or the other that one is better, but I'm just not seeing it. These are neck and neck. Once again, I'm going to declare this a tie. Again, I apologize, I sound like a broken record, but the results are what they are. Now let's check out 600mm. Going to zoom in, and once again, it looks like they are neck and neck. This looks very, very close. Now up here, I could swear that the Nikon looks a little bit sharper in this area than the Sony, but it's, again, something that I don't know if you were shooting these side by side you'd ever notice. Scroll around a little bit more here. Yeah, the Nikon looks like it might have a little bit of an edge at 600mm to me. Very, very close, though. I feel like I'm a broken record here. Now, looking on this side of the lens, though, it almost seems like the Sony might have a little bit of an edge. But going back and forth, I think from an overall standpoint, once again, it would be very difficult to tell which of these lenses were which, just based on looking at stuff that you shot in the field. Going back and forth here. And again, I mean, look at this. These are, the same kind of patterns here. You see about the same level of detail in these patterns here on these blocks. I have to say, this is kind of a tie, guys. That's another one. Let's check the lenses now with a teleconverter. So let's zoom in, and once again, I feel like I'm a broken record here. These are very close, but in this case, it does look like the Nikon does have an edge. It does seem like the Nikon is taking that teleconverter a little bit better. I'm definitely seeing a difference there. Here, it's getting a little bit closer. But again, I'm thinking that if anything, the Nikon might have a slight edge. The Sony does seem like it's a little bit sharper. My particular copy seems like it might be a little tiny bit sharper on the right side than it is on the left, but kind of looking through this, like from an overall perspective, they're both very close. We're looking at 200% crops, but I still think the Nikon has a very slight edge with a teleconverter attached. So there you go. I think the bottom line with this is that both lenses are very good performers. They're not going to rival the primes of the world, the 600 f4s of the world, but both of these lenses are very good. I think we can expect, based on how the 180-600 is comparing to the 200-600, I think we can expect that people using the 180-600 are going to be very happy with it, and it will too become a very well-regarded lens in the wildlife photography community. Overall, I have to say I'm impressed with the sharpness of the 180-600. Although my initial field test with the prototype lens looked promising, these results were better than expected. It seems to do very well at the focal lengths wildlife shooters use the most, and I think most people will be very happy with the sharpness they see in their images when using this lens. Next, let's talk AF speed. But before we get to the tests, I wanted to mention that I have recently updated my setup guide for the Nikon Z8 and Z9. The book shows you step by step how I set my Z8 and Z9 for wildlife photography and why I choose the settings I do, along with lots of advice on how to get the most from those settings in the field. Check it out. I'll put a link to the book in the description area on YouTube. For this test, I set the camera on a tripod in my backyard and pointed at a tree that's about a half a mile away. The conditions for this test were bright and sunny. Next, I hook up my Atomos so I can record the live feed from the camera. Once it's recording, I crank the lens down to minimum focus distance and then activate AF so it focuses on those distant trees. I do this multiple times for each lens, and then when I go back to the computer, I count the number of frames from when AF started to when it stopped, and I average out the results. I then take this number and convert it into tenths of a second. Here are the results. Okay, so let's start our speed comparisons, obviously, with the 180-600. Let's see how it did in our tests. This one is 0.8 seconds from minimum focus distance to infinity, or 0.83 if you put a 1.4 teleconverter on it. So basically, you're not going to really see any difference at all. I don't think a normal human can see the difference between 0.8 seconds and 0.083 using that teleconverter. So that's good news. Now, on the other hand, I do want to remind you that this was done on a sunny day with a really good target in very easy conditions. You might put that teleconverter on in tougher conditions and find that it's a little bit slower than what these numbers indicate here. So anyhow, let's go on and take a look at how it compares to some of the other lenses out there. So the first one is the Nikon 100-400Z, and this lens was a little slower than I thought at 1.08 seconds. I've used this for like close range birds in flight before, and it's been fine, but it's a little tiny bit slower than I had guessed it was. So that's the 100-400. And I said, well, what about the 400 4.5? So I put that one on and gave it a try, and that one's quick, 0.47 seconds. That's very, very fast. And if you're using that lens and put the 180-600 on right afterwards, or vice versa, if you're using them side by side, basically, you will notice a difference in speed between that 400 4.5 and that 180-600, especially if you're at close range and then going to a longer distance. For sure, you're going to see it. Next, I tried the 500 PF adapted to the Z9 with the FTZ2 adapter, and that came in at 0.57 seconds. Now, the reason I included this one, even though it's not a native Z lens, is that a lot of people have used this and are familiar with the speed at which it focuses. So this kind of gives you a comparison. This is 0.57 seconds, the other one's 0.8 seconds. There is a little bit of a difference. I'm not sure that it's going to be noticeable with most subjects, but if you're in a situation maybe where the lens is hunting, going from minimum focus distance to infinity and back, something tricky for the autofocus system maybe, and you're trying to get it to focus, you might notice that the 180-600 does feel a little bit slower. Next, we have the Nikon 600 TC. Threw it in there just for fun. I knew it was going to be quick, but wow, 0.4. It is very fast, and it is the fastest one on our comparison slide here. Next, I tried the competition, the Sony 200-600 on an A1 body, and I was a little bit surprised with this one too, 0.45. I ran that test 3 times to make sure I wasn't losing it. But 0.45 seconds, it is nearly, not quite, but nearly twice as fast from minimum focus distance to infinity as the 180-600. And that really surprised me. I knew it was a decently fast focusing lens, and I had a feeling it was faster than the 180-600, but that number really kind of blew me away a little bit. So Sony definitely has the edge in autofocus speed. And finally, I wanted to try this on more of a mid-range body. So I put on a Z7 II. Z6 II is going to give you the same kind of numbers just to see, because sometimes I've noticed that the lenses don't seem to focus as fast on the Z6 and Z7 II as they do on the Z8 and Z9. In this case, at 0.83 versus 0.8, it's, again, virtually identical as far as speed goes. So if you are thinking about this lens and you have a Z6 or Z7 II and you don't have a Z8 or Z9, it's not like you're going to take this big hit in autofocus performance. It's going to work pretty much the exact same. Now, I realize when you're looking at those numbers, it may seem like the 180-600 doesn't compare well to the rest of the field. However, in my experience, AF speed is just a little bit overrated. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to have a fast lens, especially if AF starts to hunt and the lens runs from minimum focus distance to infinity over and over again. However, for general shooting, I find that if you simply pre-focus at about the distance of your target, it's not as big of an issue as it's often made out to be on the internet. In fact, for this flight shot, I was actually using the slower 100-400 and had absolutely no problems whatsoever, even though the bird was at very close range. This was shot at 300mm. I personally have zero concern about using this lens for most bird and flight work. Now, I might want something faster if I'm shooting very small birds at close range, but for the vast majority of my bird and flight work, I think this lens is going to work just fine. So that about does it. We're finally wrapping up the video. Thank you so much for sticking with me and watching, and I hope you found it useful. If you enjoy tips like these, remember to check out my educational materials as well. All my books and video workshops are loaded with techniques you can use the very next time you're out in the field. As always, remember to subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.